Well, first of all, good to see everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching the amendment. I'm Chris Harrison, and I'm sure the first question you have is, why is the guy from The Bachelor hosting an intense panel after such an emotional film like the amendment? Well, tonight I'm taking aside my night and my day job of handing out roses. I'm actually here just as a friend and a supporter of Brooks Douglas. In a prior life, I too was living and working in Oklahoma City, and that's where I became friends with Brooks many years ago, when Brooks became the youngest state senator in Oklahoma history. And Brooks and I formed a tight bond, and was there, and I was working at a local news station during a lot of the trials and during the execution. And so I've known Brooks for many years, and so tonight I'm here as just a supporter of Brooks and a friend and a fan. And when he came to me many years ago and talked at first about this story and what he should do with it, and we started brainstorming about, books and movies and so on, all I said was, this story needs to be told, and I will do anything I can to be a part of it and to help you tell the story. So the first thing I want to do tonight is just introduce my good friend Brooks Douglas, and thank you for opening your heart, your soul, this story that I've said to you many times needs to be told, and I'm proud of you for telling it. And I can't imagine what it's like watching this over and over and over. Bravery comes to mind, but I want to turn it over to you and just say thank you. Thank you for being here, and I'd like for you to introduce our esteemed panel here tonight.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your continued involvement. You've been with us from the beginning, and your encouragement and friendship and support has been huge in bringing this to the screen, making it happen in the first place. And so I'm very, very grateful for being here tonight on your night off to be a part of this. Of course, it's my story. I'm a producer, and I play my father. I have the privilege and the honor of playing my father in the film. And again, I want to thank you guys from the audience, some of the members of the cast and families and people that have been there. Again, many of you from the beginning. So thank you. Also on the panel tonight is Darlene Hutchinson. She is, first of all, a crime victim herself, who many years ago got involved after that in helping other victims of crime, being an advocate, and has worked with a lot of people, Texas and Alabama and just around the country, and then most recently was appointed by the president, I guess, as the director for the OVC, the Office for Victims of Crime, that's in the U.S. Department of Justice, and which is a huge job. That you're just getting your feet wet in there, and very happy for you and excited that you have that position and have the chance to expand and extend the work that we have for victims, and those are some of the things we can talk about. Hope you talk about tonight. Then we have John Gillis, my friend for many years, and John was a police officer, 26 years, is that right?
26.
For the in the Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
And many years ago, his daughter was murdered, and so he's got experience on both sides of what we go through, and then he went on to become, you were on the Pardon and Parole Board for the state of California.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Or chairman at one time.
Chairman.
And also then ultimately had the job that Darlene has now as the director of the Office for Victims of Crime. And then, of course, and thank you, John and Darlene, both for making a long trip to get here. And then we have my good friend and alter ego, I just wish he was as good looking as I am before you.
One can hope.
And, Mike Vogel, who has through the years become one of my closest friends, and very grateful for him for playing the role first of all, and doing such an amazing job, I think, and so, and your continued friendship, and also for making the trip here tonight to spend with us. So, thank you guys, thank you all very much, for being a part of it, and
So thank you guys for being here, Darlene and John, for your service as well. And Mike, I'll start with you. Yeah. When someone comes to you, and obviously you've had a distinguished acting career, but when someone comes to you and says, I want you to play me, and then you hear this story, there's always pressure on an actor, but what do you feel, what went through your head when you heard Brooke's story and you heard, I want you to take this on?
Well, first, it was a lot of, all right, this can't all be true. I mean, that's several lifetimes put together into, into such a small space. And then you come to realize it is true. And then, unfortunately, he's just such a personable guy and becomes a friend, which just heaps on a ton of more pressure and responsibility in filling those shoes. And it's both at once an honor and sheer terror, because you're putting something's been put in your hands that is so delicate and so meaningful to a buddy, and you want to do it honor. You want to do it justice, and but that he had the faith in me that he did, and that I said to him very early on, I said, hey, listen, A, we're doing this really quick, and B, there's just so much happening over the course of this film that I can't. I need you to open Pandora's box to me, and just let me know at times what this was like, where you were at, what was happening, and he didn't hold back, and so there were many times where his brutal honesty and vulnerability of the events and the things that he and his family went through were quintessential in helping to filter what those experiences must have been like. But it was a real honor.
And I told you that I think the best compliment you can give an actor is, and especially when you know somebody, and I know you and I know Brooks, but I never see you in that role. I see Brooks. So it was a phenomenal job. And for those of you in Oklahoma City, if you're watching this, you'll know that this was definitely shot back in Oklahoma, from the Capitol building to the governor, and in fact the acting governor at the time, Governor Brad Henry, was the governor in the movie, and the warden. Junior's is an old stinky steakhouse in Oklahoma City, and you met on Lake Hefner with the reporter there, and so this really was a down-home, personal story. And then you took it a step further, Brooks. You decide you're going to play your father. Mm. And you and I have talked about this, and I still would love to ask, what prompted, I guess I know what prompted it, but how did you make that decision to go ahead and take that step and do that, knowing what it would entail emotionally?
Good question. First of all, when we wrote the script, I hadn't decided yet. I knew I wanted to be something. I mean, maybe it was a prison guard, but it was going to be something, but I didn't know what role that I wanted to play, and it was, and as we started moving through it, and the script was almost finished, then we started to talk about, the cast, I remember actually Paul, I think, was the first to suggest it, and then Larry Moss, who was one of the executive producers, he's a renowned acting coach, also suggested that I play my dad. And when I first started thinking about it, I remember thinking, wow, that is so cool. I mean, what an honor, be able to play him. I mean, first of all, it's a major role, and secondly, it was just, it was just such an honor to be able to do that. And but the problem was I didn't think about the crime scene.
Right.
You know, because I don't when I think about my dad, I don't picture him dying on the floor. I picture all the times that we had together, the times in Brazil, the memories that you see,
right.
and many more in the film. And so as we got closer to it, that's when I started to think, oh no, this is coming, and this is something I'm going to have to do. And I think I kept myself so busy, on the producer side, wearing the producer hat, all the things that we did, shooting in Brazil, that I just blocked it out. I just didn't think about the crime scene. And when the time came to actually shoot those scenes, it was absolutely one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. Mike knows. He and I were laying there on the floor together, and this guy, what was it, about 6 hours that you were tied up in ropes, that you just stayed there
like
tied
that,
up on the floor? It was incredible on his part. But I remember laying there and channeling, in a way, my father. It was amazing. There was actually one of the things that happened when we were shooting the crime scene was that Mike, in the moment where he scoots over and he kisses me on the forehead, I think it was Julia, my wife, that walked up to. Well, first thing that happens, you could literally feel the air being sucked out of the room
right.
when that happened, and Julia said, "I can't believe you remembered. What was it that he remembered that I'd actually kissed my father on the forehead?" And he said, "What do you mean? Mike literally took that moment and just organically felt like that was something he should do, and it was something that I actually did. I moved over, kissed my father on the forehead once I knew he was dying, and I think it's one of the most moving moments in the film."
Agreed. And Mike, again, as an actor, you learn your craft and you are in these intense scenes, but this had to be a whole different world, doing it with someone who had been through it.
Yeah. It again, but at the same time, I think good gracious, how do you talk about that event, but having Brooks there, knowing what he must be going through inside, you hit that point of just no acting where it just, you let your mind go to that place and go to what he must be going through, and it's just, honestly, I think, if I remember, I was more worried for him stepping back into that, as worried as he was, knowing that he was worried. I was literally sitting there in fear of, good gracious, what is this? What is this gonna drum up in him? Again, one of those things where it's just truly an honor to walk in this time in the safest of scenarios, back through those times, and to be a part of somehow memorializing that was really special.
And John and Darlene, I want to bring you guys into this because the three of us are tied to this so emotionally and so close to it. For someone who is seeing this for the first time, and your thoughts, John, on the movie and what it was about from your perspective.
Well, there were a couple of things that really struck me, and my hat off to Brooks for being able to do this, because I don't know that I could have done that with my daughter's murder and having to reenact that. My hat off to you.
Thank you.
That was great. And also, this tells the story of many victims, the trauma that they go through. It's the aftermath more than the real act itself, because they live that the rest of their lives. And my daughter was murdered while I was on the police department here in Los Angeles. And it was by an individual who wanted to move up in the gang hierarchy, and he wanted to get into the Mexican mafia. He's still in prison, but I don't know if I could go through a reenactment of my daughter's murder. And I have been to many murder scenes. I worked homicide for a while, and this was after my daughter's murder. And I went on to work with the Board of Prison Terms in California, and that's interviewing those individuals who have committed those acts and trying to determine whether or not they're suitable for parole. And again, it's listening to more stories. But the thing that you talk about, and that is providing rights for victims, I think what you've done with this movie is kind of set the stage to let people know across the country that victims' rights are really important. We think of the defendants' rights, as you mentioned in the movie. We crawl over the bodies of the victims to make sure that we give the defendant his rights. And victims' rights does not take away any of the defendant's rights. It just makes sure that the victim is heard in court, and that the victim has a right to be at all those hearings and has a right to be notified. So to me, this is a very important film, and I thank you for doing it. You did a great job in the movie.
And John brings up a good point, Darlene. This, as much of a story as this is about the Douglas family and Brooke's life, and forgiveness, ultimately, and Christ and the role that played in your life and in your family's life, it's a story about victims' rights, and it shines a big, bright spotlight on that. And I know that's obviously something that's right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, the movie is so vast. First of all, hats off to you that how courageous, not only this work, but what you did also in the state legislature. And it takes a very unique person to be able to take so much pain and agony and so many trials that go with it to take it to another level and help other people, because it's very selfless that you're able to contribute to and help others that come behind us. And it's such a great opportunity to highlight all that victims go through and how vast it is, and the financial issues that the family had, obviously the physical, the emotional, how long-lasting it is, as John's talking about, that people think that, that you're going to get over it or get on with your life, and it's decades often for victims. It's lifelong, depending on the crime, and some victims are able to process it differently, and so it does turn into a victims' rights issue too, because as John's pointing out, that they go hand in hand. If a victim that hasn't had an opportunity to be present or be notified, even with when the inmate was moved from one place to another, and the victims weren't notified of that, or I always think about the speedy trial. The defendant has the right to a speedy trial, but there's nobody who wants a speedy trial more than the victim. We don't have that right. And in the 80s and 90s, we were passing so many pieces of legislation, which was a good start, and we did across the country. But we can't let up. I mean, there's still so much work to be done in making sure that those rights are enforceable, and that it's not just a piece of paper, that victims truly have a place in the criminal justice system, because it's a huge part, as John knows, and Brooks, that it's a big part of their healing process too. It's just adds insult to injury when a victim's rights are trampled upon and they're ignored and not brought into the criminal justice system on the level that they should.
And Brooks, I know that was a huge part of your life and why you became state senator. And wrote that groundbreaking legislation that we saw in the amendment. And that was true. That did happen. You know, just the stuff off the top of my head, because you and I have talked for so many years about, you know, you and your sister, you know, you didn't even go to your parents' funeral.
Right.
You weren't allowed, and you guys were separated. And as you said, everything was put up for auction to pay for hospital bills. And you know, how much of this movie was, I want to tell this story, I want to talk about forgiveness and what my father was, but at the same time, how much of it was, let's shine a bright light on victims' rights?
It was you know, both and. For one, you know, it was interesting. We were talking the other day about after it happened, and after I left the Senate and left Oklahoma, I really wanted to put it behind me completely. I didn't want to be known for it. I wanted to start over, and many of our friends here in California had no idea for years that any of that had happened until they found out that we were actually making a movie about it. And but at the same time, it was something I could never really escape, and it would come up at some point in different friendships, relationships, and you know, people just find out, and it's the world of Google where you can find out just about anything you want on someone, and so it just felt like there was more pressure. Also, I had noticed, you know, there were several, you know, to go back a little bit, there was one thing that triggered my deciding to take on this kind of legislation. And one was, and Darlene just sort of hit on one of the issues, there was a couple in their 60s, a husband and wife, that came in my office one day early on in my Senate career, and they had lived in a nice suburban neighborhood, and not a lot of crime in their neighborhood, and there were 3 high school age boys that broke into their house and beat them almost to death. And then when they were finally able to recover, they did call the police. You know, the police came out. They kind of knew who these boys might be, so they were fairly quickly arrested. And then they were waiting for the DA's office to call them about testifying in a trial. And about 3 months after this had happened, they look out their front window one day, and these 3 boys are driving past their house. And you know, and they said, well, they called the DA's office and said, what happened? Well, we thought there was going to be a trial. We were going to testify. And they said, well, they pled. And so they're now already free. And there's so many things wrong with that, you know, but not the least of which is the fact that they weren't told anything. Mm-hmm. They weren't told of the status of the case. They didn't have the opportunity to speak and to give their opinion even of what an appropriate sentence might be, or just have any voice at all. And so that was one of the things that pushed me to do that. And then once I left the Senate and we had moved to California, I saw some of those things, you know, sliding back again, as Darlene and John said. But you know, there's rights, but they're not recognized. They're on the books, and a lot of that is simply because most people don't know this. There are 23 enumerated rights for the accused in the U.S. Constitution. You know, the Miranda warnings. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to a jury by a trial in front of a jury of your peers. All those things. There are 23 of them. And in terms of the rights for victims, 0, nothing. And so as much as states try to do things and to provide rights to the victims, anytime there's any kind of rub between the rights of the accused versus the rights of the victim, if a judge, depending on their predisposition, their background, whatever, if they just decide that they want to say, well, you know, I'm afraid that somehow here it might impinge on the rights of the accused, it stops. And that happens a lot. And so one of the things that I began to push for, I know John's been involved as well, and Darlene, have been to have a U.S. constitutional amendment for crime victims. And you look at the things that are going on today, you know, the shooting of a school shooting in Florida. We have Las Vegas. So many things, and yet the ones you don't hear about are cases like ours. I mean, ours was known at the time because it was just so rare. But there are crimes, people are killed every single day. These kinds of crimes happen every single day, and things that we don't hear about. And my work, my desire, is to create an environment where victims of crime can have their rights recognized, because things like having a voice in the system are what allow people, to whatever degree they're going to begin to move past what happened and to live their lives. And I'm taking a lot of time here, and I apologize, guys. But you know, it's you know, I look at what part of what hit me, you know, as we were writing this, and as a reason, which is back to your question, is when I think about what my parents would have wanted for me. Is it to have been angry and miserable, and to have my life falling apart behind the scenes, although everything looked great? I don't think so. I think they would have wanted me to live the life that I was born to live. You know, that you know, not only I wanted to live, and I believe that God wanted me to live, but that they wanted me to live, and it was to keep going. Mm-hmm. You know, not to, if I didn't physically die on that floor, that every bit of my dreams would have died on that floor as well. And so I think there are things in environment that can be created that allow people to take those steps a little bit at a time. And so much of it is how that system that they're trying to operate within is more of what's happening to them rather than they're able to participate. So, okay, I'm done.
I wanted to mention, you mentioned the constitutional amendment.
Right.
Many of the states have amended their constitution to include victims' rights, and I think there are still 11 states that have not done it. But that does not give the victim a standing in state courts.
Right.
Because it needs to be a change in the U.S. Constitution, because that's where you find all the defendants' rights. If the victim has no standing in the Constitution, then the judges can do whatever they want when it comes to rights of the victims. So it's important that we get a U.S. constitutional amendment. We have been trying that for I would say about 12 or 15 years. It has been proposed many times. Every president has agreed that we need to have an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but when it comes to Congress, they always divide among party lines because there's a large pressure group when we start talking about defendants. Victims have no representation in Congress. They don't have lobbyists. They don't have lawyers that are working the Congress floors. So unless we get a change at the federal level where we get an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, victims are still going to be slighted when it comes to being heard in court. And victims are not asking for anything more than to be heard for restitution when they've been grievously harmed. And those are the kind of things that they're looking for crime victims. And I think this movie sets the stage for that. It's something that I think everybody ought to see. I will certainly be telling folks that I know to go see it. And I think it's very important, so thank you.
One thing I often think about is that we can't go back and change a crime that's happened to a person. As much as we would all love to be able to do that, what is in our power is how we treat that victim going forward, and the rights that we allow and provide to them, or the services that we provide to them, because that's something else that's changed significantly since, say, the 80s, 70s, and 80s, 79, I think, when this incident occurred. And the crime victims compensation programs weren't around back then, And we've done a great deal to modify laws across the country and provide more services to victims. There's still so much to be done. One study that we've done within DOJ shows that about 12% of victims that report a crime, people who actually survive a violent incident, 12% receive services that enable them to move forward with their lives and to heal, and whether that's victims' compensation or counseling. There's just so many levels that we can help victims, and a lot of the resources are out there. It's just connecting victims with them and the awareness, which anything that we can do to increase awareness is always wonderful. But there's we can do something about how we treat victims moving forward when we can't change the past, obviously.
And part of exposing that is a movie like The Amendment, and having that debate. And I was going to ask you, Darlene, is it seems sadly so timely to have this movie now and be talking about victims' rights, as Brooks was talking about. It just seems like it is such a topic of discussion, unfortunately, right now in this country. Maybe more important now than it ever has been in the history of this country.
Well, an interesting thing that Brooks and I have talked about too is there's often a lot of talk about inmates and criminal justice reform, and I think all of us here probably, I want inmates to come out of prison better than they went in. 95% will be released at some point. Whatever programs we can have in place is great, but we rarely think about the parallel with victims and the struggles that, I was in college when I was a kidnapped victim, and I know Brooks, we struggle with, we don't get a free education, and which I'm not looking for a handout, but if you put the parallels there, the inmates, can get free higher education, and there's just so many programs that we just rarely look at the contrast and say, wait a minute, why are we doing this for one party and not the other? So many family members of homicide that I've known, and I've asked them, I said, how would your family have been different if you had been able to provide for those young children, your nieces, your nephews, when your sibling was taken away from you, that if you could have done that, could their lives have been better, down the road? And we just, our public officials just don't think like that, because the offenders often have the folks speaking for them.
So, go ahead, John.
There was one thing I wanted to clear up. I mentioned restitution, and I don't want people thinking that that's the most important thing that victims think about. Right. Restitution is probably at the bottom of the list. It's being heard, being able to be present when these hearings are going on. I know my daughter was murdered in 1979, and I wasn't allowed to be in court while the hearing was taking place. Nor was there any requirement that they notify me of any hearings that were taking place. So these are the kinds of things that victims want. They want to be there, they want to have input, and the input is not to determine what the sentence is going to be, but the input is to say how this crime impacted me. Brooks mentioned the financial things that they go through. I can recall when I first came on the department, it was in 1962, and I was a part of that system that when we took a victim to the hospital, they sent the victim a bill for the medical treatment, and somebody who was suffering from a gunshot wound and ended up in the hospital, they billed them after they were released from the hospital, and they had some of the best collectors in the world. The hospitals did. Right. So people lost their homes, and of course they lost their jobs and many things because there was nobody there to fight for the victim.
If I could, there's actually I have a clip, news clip. If we're able to play that, it's just from our own story. It was news footage from right around the time that these guys were caught.
Extradition proceedings have already begun to bring Hatch and Ake back to Oklahoma, but the suspects are in custody 3 days before the Douglas family home in Okarche will be auctioned to pay the medical bills of the Douglas children.
Furniture, clothing, kitchenwares, books, games, a house. Some of the possessions acquired over a lifetime by Reverend Richard Douglas and his family. About 150 people came to bid, some friends of the Douglases, others strangers just looking for a bargain.
The father, Marilyn Douglas, watched, proud that so many people showed up to help his grandchildren, but quietly grieving.
It's just more than, you know, you can ever tell.
The money, of course, can't make up for the loss of 2 lives. But for friends of the Douglas family in the Okarche area, it's a way of helping the best way they can.
When Glenn Ake and Stephen Hatch arrived in Oklahoma City early this morning in the custody of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, it marked the end of a 5-week search. A search that stretched from Louisiana to Texas, Wyoming, and finally to Colorado. The suspects were hustled off to the Canadian County Jail in El Reno. They'll make their first appearance in court on Monday.
So, I mean, that's exactly what we've been talking about. A lot of the financial impact that families experience when they go through this. And as John was saying, it's not so much about the finances. There are things that are extraordinarily unfair, and as Darlene was talking...
It's salt in the wound. It's like salt in the wound.
Oh, yeah, exactly. It's just you relive what happened because it's constantly back in your face again. And one of the things that I remember, and Darlene and I were talking about the other day, there was a young man, just as I was graduating from college, went back to Oklahoma, and this guy walked up and introduced himself, and his father had been an Oklahoma State trooper that was murdered by a guy named Monty Lee Eddings, and it became a very famous U.S. Supreme Court case dealing with offenders that were not yet 18, that they were minors, and that had committed murder. And I remember he came up and he was saying, yeah, you know, I'm going to college, I'm paying my way, I'm having to work a couple of jobs, but I'm getting through there. And you know, on into this panel discussion that I was on, and this guy was sitting a couple of rows back, and there was a psychiatrist that stood up and he said, I'm proud to announce that I work with Monty Lee Eddings, and he said, and I'm also proud to say that he has just completed his college education paid for by the state of Oklahoma, and that he's going to go to grad school, and he has just been moved from a maximum security facility to a medium/minimum security facility. And I looked down at the guy whose father had been murdered by Monty Lee Eddings, and he was just beet red. You could just see the furor in him. And I remember thinking, that's not right. I mean, and there's evidence that shows that there's less recidivism if these guys that are, or women that are in prison get an education. So it's not like you want to pull that away or necessarily take it away. But what about the victim? You know, what about the victim's family? What about the fact that now there's no father or mother or whoever it is to help them and provide for them? And that's exactly what I did and went through. So, you know, there just needs to be fairness at the end of the day. As much as we can find it, there should be fairness in the way that the victims are treated vis-a-vis the person who commits these crimes.
So where is that, Darlene?
Well, and I think there's so many facets to it that obviously we're all wired differently. Victims don't deal with things the same way. Unfortunately, sometimes when a violent crime occurs, as we've seen, families deal with it differently. Spouses can lose a child and they deal with it differently. Siblings, and sometimes it's catastrophic and can drive a wedge in a family. And so and as John's talking about, what we want out of the system is different for each person. Some don't want to be involved at all. Most, I have found, do want some level of involvement, and even victims will go back and forth during their experience. Early on, they may not want an involvement, and then a couple years into it, they go, you know what, I want to know what's going on, or they take interest in a parole hearing that maybe they didn't have as much interest in a plea bargain or a case. But I think it's a lot of publicity. It's a lot of just the outcry, and every year we host a Crime Victims' Rights Week in April, and that's been going on since '81. And that's so much for awareness. And people forget sometimes that it's Crime Victims' Rights Week. Yes, we highlight the services. Yes, we highlight all that victims have been through, but it's about the victims' rights and that they have a place in the criminal justice system, and they should. It is a balancing act. I don't pretend it's easy, but we've tackled tougher things in this world, though, and I think we can find that balance and treat victims with dignity and respect, because we didn't choose to be here. We're not the ones who, it wasn't our choices that brought us into the criminal justice system, as you certainly know about Brooks and what his family's endured, and John and so many victims out there. We're just pulled into it. And
we still live in a country where victims in court can be kicked out of court if they sit there and cry during the trial. They will be kicked out of the court because that may have an impact on the defendant's trial. Those things should not happen in our world.
And Mike, we've been talking a lot about victims' rights, but what I would love to hear from you is, how did you change from this? What's your takeaway?
Yeah, I think, you know, the two biggest things that you know, that struck me, I think, after the film and during the film, Brooks had told me at one point when he was laying there on the ground after he'd been shot, that he said there was a moment where it went through his head where he said, you know, I could just close my eyes right now, and that would be it. I think we have that. Your body has that willpower to either fight the thing that's happening for a time or not. And if you quit on it, it will quit on you. And he had that moment of just going, I could make it all stop right now. Mm-hmm. And as he was being swayed by that thought process, a voice came to him and said, if you can move, as long as you can move, you have to keep going. And he said it was almost like it was like a film reel that had slowed down and then all of a sudden popped back up again. And just that mentality of don't quit. And you look at a life that has not just done okay, but has excelled and has overcome circumstances to the point where if you had never, there's many people that become defined by the thing that has happened to them. Mm-hmm. And if you had not known this about him, you would never know. You would just think, oh, here's this exceptional, driven individual. And you would never know the circumstances that went about crafting those things. But I think going hand in hand with that is the ability to forgive. Because had he not been able to drop that baggage, those things would haunt him and chase him and eat him alive the rest of his life. And the ability to stare the person in the face who forever changed the trajectory of your life and your family, to come to a place of forgiveness, and in so doing, being able to get to those next plateaus in life. I think those were the biggest things for me, having done this, to then know the man and see how that directly impacted everything he's done since then. Well said. Mm-hmm. Senator Douglas, the floor is yours.
Oh, wow. I get to talk again. Wow.
This is not a filibuster.
Oh, yes, thank goodness. I guess picking up on what Mike just said, as you can see in the movie, number one, I didn't know that I was going to meet with Ake the day that we went there. And when it happened, it was, I mean, my life suddenly made sense. You know, it was, okay, wait a minute. This is why I became a lawyer. This is why I was in the military and learned to do cool stuff. And this is why, you know, I became a senator, was because, you know, there's finally going to be justice here. Ake had escaped justice, and, you know, now there might be a little self-help involved, but, you know, he's not going to forever. And that was the way I was processing it before I walked into the room. And I remember feeling like that I'd always been a happy person, and but I never anticipated to feel the amount of rage that I felt when I started to think about being in the room with the guy. And I was convinced when I walked in there, one or the other of us wasn't going to walk out, and I didn't really care which one of us it was at the moment. It was just something was going to have to stop all this anguish and you know, the things that were spinning inside of me that were causing my life to steer really out of control behind the scenes. And I think that, and then that moment came, and it was you know, one of the most dramatic things since the shootings that ever happened in my life. I remember I didn't even see it coming. I actually walked over to the door and was about to walk out, and I just felt like this isn't over. And I walked back over and I looked at him and I said again, you know, I told him early in the conversation, you know, my parents taught me that I should forgive, and I said, but that's not what I'm about. That's not what's going to happen, and so don't count on it. And then at the end of and I kept him there for an hour and a half. And it was really because he had apologized, and I wanted him to have to look me in the face. And I knew this is a guy that doesn't look people in the eye very often. And so I'm going to make him look at me, and if when his guard drops, you know, I'm going to see if he's for real or not. And there was that moment when he was wiping the tears away and fighting with the cuffs that I saw sincerity. And so when I walked back over to the table, and I said, you know, again, my father was a minister and taught me that I should forgive. I said, but, and then I remember just saying the words, "I forgive you," and it was such an overwhelming. I remember falling back in my chair, and you know, Mike, you did a great job of portraying it. It was like my body and my head were full of poison. And it was almost like the bottoms of my feet opened up, and I could just almost physically see water flooding all over the place. And I remember almost hyperventilating because it felt like somebody took a clamp off of my chest, and I could just breathe. I mean, for the first time in 15 years. And I called my sister a night or two later, and I said, look, you know, I want you to know, and this is during a time when we were not close. But I called her and I said, look, you need to know this. I said, I don't know if I'll ever talk publicly about this, but you need to know. And I'm not telling you this is something you have to do. I felt I have no right to tell her something like that, you know. I mean, what she went through, and everybody goes their own journey. But I wanted her to know what I did and to understand that this was just, for me, this is what I needed to do to begin to walk forward and to live my life, you know, and it was one of the best decisions that I've ever made. It was life-changing, and for a long time, it took a while for that to bear out. I mean, for 6 months, I was just depressed because I think I'd carried that anger around for so long that I just didn't even see it anymore. But it you know, it was genuine.
Well, the movie is genuine.
Yeah.
It's an incredible movie. I thank you for being here tonight. Wherever you're watching this movie, I thank you. I thank you for taking the time to watch The Amendment, and I hope that the movie moved you, and I hope you will spread the word about this movie, and I hope you will spread the message that this movie carries. And again, huge thanks to our panelists tonight, Mike, John, Darlene, and of course, a huge thanks to you, my friend, Brooks Douglas, for this story, for this movie, and for this night.
Thank you, my friend.
All right. Thank you. God bless.